gentlemen, this slide, the face of a monster. Lois Hylas Schicklgruber.
As we come upon the Second World War,
you
need to understand why the war happened and what the roots of the war were. Remember that the United States fought the war on two fronts. We fought against the Germans and we fought against the Japanese. The reasons that both nations fought in the war were not the same. There were similarities, but they were not the same. So we're going to see the roots of the war in Europe, then the roots of the war in Asia, then American foreign policy in the 1930s, and then moving toward the brink, and we'll finally finish with a day of infamy. He then moved on into Germany.
On the left, you see Adolf Hitler and his World War I.
And there he enrolled in the Kaiser's armies and fought in the First World War along the Western Front, where he was eventually blinded by gas. He was not well liked by his fellow troops, but he was well respected as a very brave fighter. He was blinded by gas and was in the hospital when the armistice was signed. In this slide on the right, you see the face of another monster. And when he heard of this, he ripped the bandages off of his eyes and said he could see more clearly.
Was born. Now let's look at the roots of the war in Europe. Germany, of course, as we know, struggled under the shame of the defeat in World War I. They believed, many in the army and the military and the Prussian aristocracy believed that they had been stabbed in the back by their own citizens, led by Jews and communists in Germany that they had given in when they could have probably won, which is not exactly the second problem for Germany is that the Weimar Republic was Germany's very first republic. Germany had been an empire since the 1870s. Prior to that, it had been the loose association of Germanic states under what we used to know as the Holy Roman Empire and then the Confederation of the Rhine. But eventually, the Weimar Republic began to fail. It began to fail because many said it was decadent. It was not exactly as the full line of greatness of Germany. Although the Weimar Republic was very successful, it was a time of great culture. Eventually there arose other factions within Germany, all saying that we need to reclaim German greatness, or how should I put it, make Germany great again. One of these parties was the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which later simply became known as the National Socialist Party. And the man you see in the picture to the right is Rome, who was actually the founder of the National Socialist Party, which later becomes a member of the Nazi Party, adopting the ancient life symbol from the Hindu, the swastika. Big Four, Wilson. One of its cornerstones was anti-Semitism. Eventually, however, Hitler gains control of the Nazi Party from Rome. Rome was a, let's just say he was a devout homosexual, and Hitler used that against him to eventually have him purged from the party and many of the old leadership in what was known as the Night of the Long Knives. All the necessary in Italy, you had the fascist party by Benito Mussolini. Now, Italy had had a successive number of rulers, all of which had failed to achieve full legitimacy in the eyes of the people until 1929, when Mussolini signs the Lateran Treaty. The Lateran Treaty is the agreement that Italy signs with the Pope, and when the Pope recognizes the Italian state, that gives Mussolini legitimacy. Now, the Lateran Treaty is very important because it also creates the independent city-state we know as Vatican City, 1 square mile. This is very important during the Second World War, because the Vatican will remain Japanese invade China proper. And back to the Italian picture at the beginning of these notes. Now Mussolini decides that he wants to reclaim the ancient Roman Empire, the infamous massacre. And so in 1935 he begins his first conquest. He invades a very backwards nation, Ethiopia. Now the Ethiopians, who were led by their king Haile Selassie, who is believed to have been a direct descendant of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba.
own economic sphere that it could
Was one of two independent African nations at the time.
prosperity.
When Italy invades Ethiopia, many African Americans asked for the United States to issue some sort of condemnation or even intervene in some sort of way.
See in the upper right-hand corner,
The United States does not. Now, as a result of this, loses a great deal of credibility in the eyes of African
Hirohito is
Americans.
very mild-mannered.
In Russia, you have Joseph
shy,
Vissarionovich
and
Lukashvili
Stalin,
Stalin,
botany more
who
than anything
ruthlessly ascends to
and
power
did
after the
not
death of
rule
Leonard.
Japan directly and conducts a number of communist
time of the
purges.
1930s, the military has taken over Japan.
And why is that
and are
important?
ruling Japan in the
Because
name
Stalin,
of
in purging the Communist Party of all men of ability or any sort of ambition, deprives his army of some of the best generals and leaders that they have. And this will be almost a death knell to the Soviet Union in 1941 when the Nazis come invading. There is one further dictator that bears notice, and his name is Francisco Franco, known as El Caudillo, Generalissimo Francisco Franco, who fights the Spanish Civil War against the Republican forces. The Spanish Civil War, which goes from 1936 to 1939, is very important. Why? Because on Franco's fascist side, you have the Nazis and the Italians sending their men, and most importantly their pilots, to Spain as sort of a training ground for the upcoming military operations that they no doubt wish to follow.
The bottom line is not red, white, and blue.
The Soviets, on the other side, support the Republican cause in Spain, and so they send their soldiers, advisors, and their pilots over. And so the Spanish Civil War from 36 to 39 devastates Spain.
He was no fan of
Franco removes the king for a time, until at which point he decides the king can take back over from him. And the Nazis and Italians fight it out with the Russians as a training ground for World War II.
When asked about his sudden change in opinion toward Franklin Roosevelt, Vandenberg simply shrugged it off and said right at the cameras, "Politics stops at the water's edge." In the upper left is Secretary of State Cordell Hull, originally from Tennessee, a good staunch Southern Democrat. He served as Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of State from 1933 until 1944. He continues to be the longest serving Secretary of State. The bottom right, you see Sumner Welles to the right of the picture, and second from the left in his military uniform is Fulgencio Batista, who is the president dictator of Cuba. He would be replaced in 1959 by Fidel Castro. Not everyone found the Neutrality Acts to be advantageous, and many lampooned the Neutrality Acts as being too soft on the aggressor powers and giving the defenders a disadvantage at times. Here is one particular cartoonist who inveighed against the Neutrality Acts, and that is none other than Theodore S. Geisel. S stands for Seuss. This is Dr. Seuss, who well before we had the Cat in the Hat had many political cartoons. A tragic series of missteps and miscalculations is going to bring both Europe and Asia to the brink of war and then plunge it into war as well. In 1936, Italy and Germany signed a treaty of friendship in which Mussolini declared that there was an axis between Rome and Berlin on which the world would turn. This is why they are known as the Axis powers. Germany and Japan in 1937 signed an anti-Comintern pact, pledging to help each other prevent the spread of communism out of the Soviet Union and into other countries, of which they were on either end. In 1939, Italy and Germany signed what was called the Pact of Steel, which was a military alliance pledging to come to each other's aid if the other was attacked. Now, for Germany, they began to violate the Treaty of Versailles on several occasions, and each and every time, the leaders of England and France, who could have prevented this from happening, decided not to do it because they believed in their hearts that having Germany strong again would be a stabilizing force in Europe. And furthermore, they were all very, very tired from the First World War and did not want to see a reprise of that. So Germany begins to rearm itself in violation of the treaty. And everybody said that's okay because Germany needs to have some greatness back again and needs to recover from the Depression. And everybody except one person said that this is okay. But this one person said, no, I don't believe that this is a good idea, and you should be careful of this guy Hitler. In 1936, Germany sent its troops marching across the Rhine River into the Rhineland of Germany, which is the west bank of the Rhine River. This was a demilitarized zone by the Treaty of Versailles. This could have easily provoked Britain and France into invading Germany and putting down this movement. And they would have been strong enough to do so. They did not. And once again, everybody said this was for the good of Germany and that we can deal with it, and most importantly, we want to avoid war. And there was just one person standing out in the wilderness saying, no, don't do this. Do not treat Germany this way. You need to be strong with them or you'll be sorry. In 1938, Germany looked south to Austria, another German-speaking nation. Austria, which had been reduced in size after the First World War, now was open to annexation. In 1938, Hitler marched his troops down to Vienna and annexed Austria. This is called the Anschluss. Again, a violation of Versailles. Again, the main powers said nothing or said we need to have Germany strong. And there was that one person out in the wilderness saying, no, do not deal with Hitler. Later in 1938, though, Germany turned its attention to Czechoslovakia. The outer western rim of Czechoslovakia is called the Sudetenland, and there were many ethnic-speaking Germans there who suddenly started claiming oppression by the Czechs, who were their overlords, essentially. Now, this sounds familiar to what's going on in Ukraine today. As a result of this, Hitler now begins to pressure Czechoslovakia to give up the Sudetenland. There's one problem, however. This is the country's natural fortifications. It's a mountainous region. It also is the region in which the Czechs have most of their munitions factories. And the Czechs are very good at making munitions. The Czechs begin to arm for war. They have a very good army and could have held off for quite a long time. It's at this point that suddenly the leaders of Great Britain and France, especially Great Britain, call for a peace conference in Munich to try and solve the problem. And there you have Neville Chamberlain of Great Britain and Edouard Daladier of France, who basically follows along with whatever Chamberlain's going to do. And they sit down with Hitler, they sit down with Mussolini, they bring the Soviets in, and so you have Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, and Italy, all talking about the fate of Czechoslovakia. The Czechs were not at the table. They were told to stay back, and they would work out the deal. In the end, as an agreement for not starting a war, Hitler was given the Sudetenland. This comes to be known as the policy of appeasement. Appeasement is any policy in which you give in to an aggressor in order to avoid military conflict. On the left, you see Il Duce. On the right, you see the Führer. At the outset of the 1920s, Mussolini had been in power a full 11 years before Hitler came on the scene, and Hitler was considered to be the junior power to Italy. But over time, Germany then took the lead. Neville Chamberlain flew home to Great Britain after the Munich conference and held up the paper that blew about in the wind and said, I have here the document that is peace in our time, and everybody said that he was a great statesman and had done it again. In truth, he had been thoroughly outclassed by Hitler. But the Allies did come to one resolution. Hitler would not be allowed to move any further without a military response. Because now Hitler and Germany were looking toward Poland, when all of a sudden the unthinkable happened. Germany and the Soviet Union, two diametrically opposed systems of government, Nazi Germany and Soviet communism, now reached a non-aggression pact, and Poland was right in the middle. On September the 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland using a new form of warfare called Blitzkrieg, which means lightning war. It means using tanks to punch a hole in the forward defenses, using your aircraft to bomb those same defenses, and then sweeping in from around behind them. It took Great Britain and France 2 days, but they declared war on Germany on September the 3rd. The Soviet Union then invaded Poland from the east, and the Poles fell within 6 weeks. And one of the reasons being is that the Polish army was still using cavalry on horses with lances, and they were going up against German tanks. Here you see the country of Germany in gold, and you notice there is the west bank of the Rhine River called the Rhineland, which Germany then took over in contravention of the Treaty of Versailles. Then you see also Austria, which it annexed in 1938. And you see Czechoslovakia, which is now the Czech Republic and Slovakia, but at the time they were one country, and the Sudetenland around the Western Rim. And then Hitler then took over the rest of Czechoslovakia in early 1939. And then you also see, of course, the invasion of Poland that only took 6 weeks to conquer. You will notice also that Great Britain and France, despite declaring war on Germany, could do very little to help Poland, because it was, after all, on the other side of Germany. This is another map of Europe showing Germany's predations against Poland as well as the Soviets, and a Polish child leaning over one of her parents who's been killed in an air raid. You also see Britain and France essentially able to do nothing against Germany at this point. What Britain and France did was essentially send its troops to the Western Front along the western border of Germany. And there they sat in trenches waiting for World War I to start up all over again. Both armies were not well led. The French army was very poorly led. The British army was there basically to serve as a protection for the Low Countries of the Netherlands and Belgium. The Germans were not going to fight World War I over again. They were going to use Blitzkrieg. As they sat out on the spring of 1939 and then into 1940, this came to be known as the Phony War, or the Sitzkrieg. But in the spring of 1940, the Nazis went back to work. They invaded Denmark, and Denmark fell in one day. They then took over in Norway, as Britain and the Germans fought over Norway. And then they invaded the Low Countries and France in 1940. And once again, the Blitzkrieg worked against the more powerful French army, but the Germans had the better tactics, and they overwhelmed the French armies. The British army was pushed against the sea, and it looked like it would be pushed into the sea when they were able to evacuate from Dunkirk. This is where the famous movie with Harry Styles is in, Kenneth Branagh and others, in which the British used literally every single craft that they could find. Yachts, the Prince of Wales had a yacht, the King had a yacht, the fishermen, shrimpers, you name it. And in this way they were able to pull more than 300,000 men across the Channel to England. France fell. France surrendered. German troops you see marching through Paris, down the Champs-Élysées. And England is all alone in this. On the day that the Nazis invaded the Low Countries, that is, Netherlands and Belgium and France. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who you see in the upper right, resigned his office under pressure. He was already dying of cancer, and he had failed in keeping the peace in Europe. The lower right is the leader of Norway who collaborated with the Nazis. His name has become synonymous with collaboration with an enemy. His name is Vidkun Quisling. So a Quisling is anyone who collaborates with the enemy. This map shows the invasion of France as the Germans broke through the little town of Sedan, which is the gateway to France, somewhat to the northwest of Paris. They had been the scene of many a great battle over time. You see Dunkirk, which is spelled in the French manner, up on the coast near the very north of France. And then the German army swept all the way to the Atlantic coast. What happened to France was this. The lower southeastern quadrant of France around the town of Vichy became known as Vichy France. Vichy was known for its mineral baths, and it became a collaborationist regime, neutral in the war. France had surrendered. Now, there were French that were in England and French also that would evacuate to North Africa and call themselves the Free French and would continue on the war. But Vichy France was left in the under the leadership of a senile old World War I general named Henri Pétain, and would collaborate with the Nazis. Throughout my notes telling you about Hitler's constant violation of the treaty, I noted that most everyone went along with what Hitler and Mussolini were doing, with the exception of one man, I said, who stood out in the wilderness. That's the man right there, Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, a descendant of the great Duke of Marlborough. Churchill had served as Secretary of the Navy, or what they call Lord of the Admiralty, in World War I, but after a disastrous campaign in which he failed, he had to resign. He went to the trenches of World War I, but then he was called back to the government to become Minister of Munitions because he was simply too valuable to risk on the front and too good in the cabinet. He then went back into Parliament after that and served in Parliament, but he was considered to be something of an outlaw, a man in the wilderness, belonging to no party, more to the Conservative than the Liberal Party, but he actually changed parties several times. His mother was born in the United States. Her name was Jenny Jerome. His father was a notable politician in England. He is brought back at the beginning of World War II as the First Lord of the Admiralty, which is the Secretary of the Navy. And all the ships signaled, Winston's back, Winston's back. And then, after Chamberlain resigned, he was made British Prime Minister and promised victory. Notice his V sign right there. He was well known for having a very, very distinct British lisp, a speech impediment that he fought to overcome his entire life. He was well known for being a dry wit. He was well known for being dogged and determined. He did not have many friends in Parliament or the cabinet, but he had plenty of people who respected him. And he said when he came to power that I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat, and begins to rally the British people. In perhaps his finest and most memorable speech before the Parliament, Churchill stood before his people and said that the Battle of Britain was about to begin because the French had surrendered. And he told the British people to steel themselves to the task at hand, that together they would overcome. So that, in his own words, if the British realm should last for 1,000 years, men will say this was their finest hour. The Battle of Britain was a battle between the British Royal Air Force and the German Luftwaffe. Outnumbered 3-2, the British Royal Air Force nonetheless held firm, and continued to fight the Germans and drop more planes than the British lost. At this point, Germany then turns its attention to London and begins to bomb London as well as other cities like Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool, Bristol, and Coventry, industrial centers. In London at this particular time was a CBS News correspondent named Edward R. Murrow, and he would bring home to the American people each evening the sounds of the bombs that were falling in London, that fell on homes, that fell on people, and so forth. The British were not just fighting the Battle of Britain, but they were also fighting the Battle of the Atlantic. Being an island nation, Britain needed to import its goods mostly from the United States. British shipping was targeted by the German U-boats, the Unterseeboots, again, were prowling about in wolf packs. And so Britain put together what was known as a convoy system, in which you had a convoy of freighter ships that were being constantly circled by British destroyers, and if a wolf pack would come, then the British convoy would scatter so that they would meet up at a later rendezvous point. Now, what is the United States' response to all this? In 1939, Roosevelt, knowing full well that the United States is still neutral in this, gives an address to the American people saying, we need to be prepared for anything. And that includes war. But there was still a great deal of public opinion against intervention, and the Neutrality Act of 1939 ended the embargo, though, on goods that were shipped so that Britain could now import weapons and materials of war from the United States. To prepare for this, the possibility of war, Roosevelt in 1940 signs into law the Burke-Wadsworth Act, creating a military draft. This is the first peacetime military draft in the nation's history. Roosevelt then also puts a 300-mile shield around Latin America. He essentially tells Hitler and the Germans, who had a great deal of influence in countries like Brazil and Uruguay and Argentina, to stay the hell out of South America. The Monroe Doctrine is still very much in effect here, and this 300-mile shield will keep German warships out of South American territorial waters. This is 1940. It is a presidential election year. The United States does not postpone elections because of the imminence of war. We did not even postpone our election in 1864 during a civil war. In an unprecedented move, Roosevelt is renominated for a third term as president. He now chooses Henry Wallace, a liberal New Dealer, as his vice president. He replaces John Nance Garner on the ticket. The Republican Party chooses a former Democrat, Wendell Willkie of Illinois, one of the nicest men ever to be in politics. Willkie revives the Republican Party in the Midwest and the West that had been shattered by the Great Depression. His campaign attacks wastes in the New Deal, and he accused FDR of secretly planning to enter the U.S. in the war. Despite all this, FDR won an unprecedented third term, and FDR realized that Willkie was using politics and was not getting personal, and FDR brought Willkie in as an advisor to the administration. Unfortunately for Wendell Willkie, he will not be able to run again in 1944 because he was already dying of cancer himself and would die of cancer in 1944. Here you see the 1940 presidential election showing the places where Willkie did very strongly, such as in the state of New York, which was Roosevelt's own home state, although he doesn't win the state, because the city of New York and cities like Buffalo and Albany went very strongly for Roosevelt. Notice where Roosevelt does very strongly, though, in a very solid Democratic South. Britain, in order to keep its convoy system viable and to keep supplying, needed more destroyers. They asked the United States to give them 50 old World War I tubs, essentially, that had served as destroyers in World War I. The United States said, that's fine, but our Neutrality Act is really going to cause us some issues. The British said, well, we'll swap you bases in the Caribbean. And that was the deal. And so the United States now is showing itself to be the supplier of Great Britain. But eventually Britain runs out of money to pay for the war. Wars cost money. And so, as a result of this, Roosevelt now introduces legislation into Congress called Lend-Lease. Lend-Lease, as Roosevelt describes it, if your neighbor's house is on fire and he needs to borrow your garden hose, you don't ask him to pay for the hose. You lend it to him and you expect the hose to come back. Lend-Lease will send war materials, trucks, planes, ships to the Allies. The United States will be given more bases to help protect the West. This essentially ends neutrality. And the man that he puts in charge of Lend-Lease is the man that he had put in charge of the WPA, Harry Hopkins. Now, in the early part of 1941, Roosevelt secretly left the United States, supposedly to go on a fishing trip, but really he went to Halifax, Nova Scotia. And there, waiting in Halifax, Nova Scotia, was the British warship Prince of Wales, a battleship, and on it was Churchill. Roosevelt and Churchill met for the first time in their lives. We meet at last, Mr. President. At long last, Mr. Prime Minister. The two men were very, very cordial with each other. They liked each other right away. They shared one mind on many, many things, and of course, why not? The two men were actually distant cousins. You see them sitting there on the deck of the Prince of Wales. Notice that Roosevelt is sitting in a chair, not in a wheelchair, because it was understood you did not take pictures of Roosevelt in his wheelchair. The two men had a long talk, and what they came out with was a statement of policy. It's not a law. It's not even an executive order. But it was called the Atlantic Charter. Essentially what they do is they understand that the United States is going to be in this war, and they will agree to no territorial aggrandizement. There will be no territorial changes made against the wishes of the people, and that they will restore self-government to those deprived of it. Now, at this particular moment, they are really focusing on Europe. But many others who read the Atlantic Charter later are going to say, well, we hope it applies to us as well, even though we're not Europeans. It was the summer of 1941, and it may have been the greatest season in Major League Baseball to date. 27-year-old Joseph DiMaggio of the New York Yankees got a hit on May the 15th and proceeded to then hit in 56 consecutive games, stopping finally on July the 10th in Cleveland when he went 0 for 4. No man has ever come close to this. The second longest hitting streak is 44 by Pete Rose in 1978. DiMaggio, the day after, then started a 16-game hitting streak. So if he had actually gotten that hit in Cleveland, he would have hit safely in 73 straight games. After the streak ended, the attention now shifted to 25-year-old Ted Williams of the Boston Red Sox, a consummate professional, a sort of a surly young man. Williams batted at or around the 400 mark throughout most of the season, reaching all the way up into 420 at one point, before his average began to steadily decline near the end of the season. On the last day of the season, his average stood at .3997. That would have rounded up to 400, and his manager asked him, hey, do you want to sit this one out? You'll still round your way up to 400. Williams said, I didn't do it to have my toenails on the line. Either I break the record or I don't. And so he decided to hit away in the doubleheader, in which he went 4 for 6, and he batted .406 in 1941. No man has ever batted 400 in a Major League Baseball season since. And there you see the two men. who were rivals and yet got along very, very well with each other, despite being from the hated Yankees and the hated Red Sox.
There is an aerial view of Pearl Harbor, the great fortress bastion of the United States Navy on the island of Oahu, somewhat to the west of the city of Fingers. And you see there a couple of problems then served as naval attaché right away. One is that there was a time, one channel that actually leads out into the ocean from Pearl Harbor. The great admiral of the American fleet, which was in there, could be effectively bottled up if just one ship was sunk in the channel. In the middle of Pearl Harbor, you see an airstrip Japanese facilities. That's called Ford Island. That's a U.S. Japanese who air spanning further and further left of Ford Island into Asia, and now into battleship China, along in the ire of the United States. The United States was beginning to be even more strong in its words to Japan, but also stronger in its actions, and made up creating an oil embargo, left out the aircraft were also there. He was engaged in negotiations with Japanese ambassador to the U.S. The main base of the United States was not you see in the upper right main base of the United States. A former admiral in the Japanese Navy who moved into well-organized foreign service. The United States negotiating with Pearl. The Japanese felt that Nomura was too much of a congenial old man, was not really reflective of the strong militaristic bent that the Japanese had, and so they sent a special envoy to join Nomura in the negotiations. The man in the lower right is Saburo Kurusu. Kurusu was a much harder negotiator. Kurusu is the man who actually negotiated the Tripartite Pact, which meant that Japan allied itself with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. An agreement that not many people in the Japanese Navy went along with, especially Yamamoto and Nomura. It is these two men who are engaging in negotiations with Cordell Hull at the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor.
French Indochina, that is the countries of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. When the French government fell in 1940, Japan moved in on the French colonial possessions because they had great supplies of tin, quinine, which helps with malaria disease, and, most importantly, rubber. This also resulted in what was known later as the Tripartite Pact, in which Japan, Germany, and Italy, all three signed a military alliance. Not every Japanese in the country wanted this particular Tripartite Pact, Yamamoto among others. But nonetheless, this tied Germany to Japan and to Italy and Japan as well. The U.S. response to this was to freeze Japanese assets in the country, the same way that we're doing with Russian assets in the country today. They imposed a scrap iron embargo and, most importantly, an oil embargo. And this led the Japanese to make plans to move into the Dutch East Indies, which is the country of Indonesia today, to take over that valuable supply of oil. At the same time, the Japanese government was now turned over to the militarist Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, whom you see there in the picture. Now, Tojo is often compared with Hitler, and that's not an accurate comparison. Tojo was not Hitler by a long shot. He was a devout Japanese nationalist. He was a committed militarist. He was brutal in his own way, but he was not the mass murderer on the scale that Hitler was. Nonetheless, he will be held as one of the chief criminals of World War II in the Pacific. What the Japanese military, both the Army and the Navy, decided is that the plan of attack on the United States would be in such a way as to hinder the U.S. from keeping the Japanese from moving down into the East Indies, the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia. It was not intended, though, to be a full-scale battle. The Japanese knew that they could not match off against the Americans mano a mano. They had to have some sort of a surprise attack, which they would do on Pearl Harbor, which was very similar to the Japanese attack on the Russian fleet back in the early 1900s during the Russo-Japanese War. The man who planned this attack was Yamamoto Isoroku. He, as I've said earlier, studied in the United States and knew the Americans very well. But here's the key thing. The Japanese designed this plan to be executed after Japan delivered its ultimatum. That is, it was not supposed to be a sneak attack. It was supposed to be a surprise attack. Nonetheless, it was a sneak attack. How did this happen? The ultimatum to the United States was delivered to the Japanese embassy to deliver to the United States on Sunday when all the secretaries had gone home. They had to have an assistant consul there do the typing, which he was not very good at, and this took actually several hours. And this meant that the ultimatum was delivered after the attack happened on the morning of December the 7th, 1941. Near 7 o'clock in the morning, Japanese planes appeared over Oahu and then over Pearl Harbor. They sunk 9 battleships or damaged them heavily. 188 aircraft were destroyed. Many of those aircraft had been pulled out of the hangar and lined up on the runway because General Short, lacking proper intelligence, lacking proper information from Washington, believed that the Japanese were going to try and sabotage the planes in their hangars. So he had them pulled out onto the runway, and that meant that they were sitting ducks for the Japanese. 2,402 military and civilian personnel were killed. 1,282 were wounded. The next day, December the 8th, 1941, Franklin Roosevelt now stood before a joint session of Congress. He delivered what was known as the Day of Infamy speech. Yesterday, December the 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy. And he goes on to explain the attacks that the Japanese did against American and Allied installations. It was not just Pearl Harbor. They attacked Wake Island. They attacked Singapore. They attacked Hong Kong. They attacked the Dutch East Indies. This was a well-coordinated attack. Later in the day, they even attacked the Philippines and destroyed the American Air Force on the Philippines. Congress now voted overwhelmingly to declare war. It was not unanimous, however, because there was one dissenting vote in Congress. Her name was Jeannette Rankin, the first woman ever elected to Congress from the state of Montana. She said, "I could not allow this vote for war to be unanimous. Somebody had to speak for peace. It's not that I disagreed with the war," she said. "I wanted to be someone who voted for peace." It was a profile in courage. Her congressional district, the people of her congressional district were very angry at her, and they turned her out of office. But she did stand by her principles. On December the 11th, 1941, both Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The reaction among the Germans and the Italians to the Führer and the Il Duce's news that they had declared war on the United States was shock. They were not ready for something like this, and they quite frankly did not want it. And so there was a great sense of doom over Rome and Berlin at this particular time. This is the route that the Japanese carrier task force took from the northern islands of Japan under great secrecy, and then sailed to a point north of Oahu, where they launched in the morning of December the 7th. And then, after the attack was completed, they then hightailed it back to Japan. But the attack was not actually completed. They sunk the battleships. They sunk several cruisers. They damaged all the planes and destroyed the planes. But the American Aircraft Carrier Task Force was not in Pearl Harbor that day. Those were the real prizes. Furthermore, Nagumo made the choice not to launch a second attack because the carriers were not there, in which he would have tried to destroy the oil installations on Pearl Harbor. He was worried that the American Carrier Task Force might show up, and then the Japanese would be in trouble. So he makes the decision to turn for home. This is the USS Arizona, commissioned in 1911. You see here in the picture, it has the old mesh masts that would later be replaced. This is the USS Arizona on the eve of World War II. You see that the old mesh masts have been replaced by the new conning tower masts. The ship was retrofitted. It was considered one of the finest ships in the fleet. It was not the flagship, however. That was the USS Pennsylvania. A Japanese Zero dropped a bomb right down the smokestack of the Arizona, which exploded in its forward magazine, which is where they kept all the ammunition. The ship literally broke in two and began to bend. And you see how the mast is bending over like that? That's because it's melting. 1,100 men went down with this ship, and those 1,100 men are still there to this day. The Arizona has not been decommissioned. It remains in service, but it is a military tomb. The ship was left in Pearl Harbor as a reminder to all the Marines and Army personnel that were coming into Pearl to be shipped to other places in the Pacific, as a reminder of why they were fighting. Eventually, what they did is they cut the top of the superstructure off the ship, but they left the bodies in there. This is the USS Arizona today, with its monument over the top of it. Notice how it bends in the middle to show how we bent but did not break after Pearl Harbor. You see the old mooring mast on the left center of the screen, and at the top right of the screen is the landing platform where boats come to deliver tourists to visit. The most visited spot in all of Hawaii, and the ethnic group that visited this spot the most, are the Japanese.
Amidst the tragedy of Pearl Harbor, heroes were not in short supply, and they sometimes came from the unlikeliest 16 men in all were awarded the Medal of Honor. African Americans were still not allowed positions in the military outside of service medals of honor. There you see Isaac Kidd, a rear admiral,